and a warm welcome to the Open Treasury podcast, your go-to source for the latest news and analysis in corporate cash and treasury management. This show is brought to you by ctmfile.com and the Treasury News Network, where treasury professionals learn and share the information that matters most. I am your host, Pushpendra Mehta. First of all, I would like to wish our Open Treasury podcast listeners, the CTM File audience, and our guest for today, Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner and Strategic Treasurer, a very happy new year and the very best for 2024.
To you too, Push.
Thank you so much. Craig, this is our first podcast this year, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to converse with you again. Thank you for taking the time to share your perspectives with us on topics that impact the world of corporate cash and treasury management. Our audience can read articles, interviews, and industry roundups by visiting ctmfile.com or by following the links in our show notes. Craig, on ctmfile.com, we are in the process of publishing a 4-part article series titled Top 8 Areas of Priority for Corporate Treasury in 2024. Of the 8 areas, we have chosen 4 focus areas for our discussion today, namely impact of climate vulnerabilities, rise in regulatory scrutiny, the evolving payments ecosystem, and a likely surge in payments fraud in 2024. We would love to get your views, Craig, on what to expect this year from each of the 4 focal themes. Let's start with the impact of climate change-induced natural disasters that is likely to be one of the biggest challenges facing corporations and their treasury teams this year. Please feel free to disagree with us or what we have published and present what you truly believe. And your viewpoints and your expert opinion is highly valued. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit's white paper, Risk Outlook 2024, climate change models point to increased frequency of extreme weather events. So far, these have been sporadic and in different parts of the world, but they could start to happen in a more synchronized manner. Severe droughts and heat waves have already weighed on crop yields, and the return of El Niño could exacerbate weather events and lead to record high global temperatures in 2024. El Niño, as outlined by the World Meteorological Organization, is marked by warmer global temperatures that heighten the likelihood of severe weather and climate events. These may include heat waves, drought, wildfires, heavy rain, and floods across various regions. The EIU white paper reckons that such climate and weather disruptions, in conjunction with geopolitical factors such as the breakdown of a grain export deal between Russia and Ukraine, may intensify operational strain on industries reliant on commodities such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Craig, given the expected rise in climate hazards in 2024 and their potential impact on corporate balance sheets, do you think it is important for more treasury professionals to harness climate risk intelligence and integrate climate-related shocks into existing risk management systems?
Well, Push, as we look at this and we see a difference across the globe, what organizations are doing, what countries are focused on. We've discussed how certain areas are more focused on climate, ecology items. Some are focused on social. There's a significant difference in terms of how the overall society views it, and that's certainly true in the finance area and with Treasury as well. So how can you break the risk out? What is the actual climate change doing? And what's the difference between a model and what actually occurs? What's the direct impact? What are some of the indirect impacts? So if there's a lot of action that requires regulation and changes, that can have a very quick and dramatic indirect impact on what's being done, how you source energy, how things are shipped. There's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy and a reverberation on there. Though the movements towards more regulation, more guidance on what's being done tends to be in one direction, towards more. There's a bit of a lull, I think, in the last bit of 2023 for concerns about greenwashing, how much is really an impact. And I think any national or global activities to reduce the anthropogenic impacts on, let's say, warming or impact on global temperatures and weather has to be balanced with what are the costs for doing that economically. Stopping human production will change and cause many, many people to die. That's a side effect. And that's, more for what the politicians are working at. From the Treasury perspective and the finance perspective is what is likely to be the case. There tends to be more growth, more focus on, are you doing something? Are you reporting things? Are you taking into account these risks? Some are being very, from the investor standpoint, like BlackRock pushing things down. So it's not something you can ignore completely, and it's not something you can say, hey, we have to do everything to completely change, how a business operates. So finance can look and should look at, what are you doing with your bonds, your borrowing? How are you supporting, what's occurring in the organization? So I think there's some elements of the risk when people say the world's going to end in 10 years. And we know we passed many of those 10 years in our lifetimes. I always remember I had a problem with something in my mouth, and the orthodontist or whatever the oral surgeon was said, you're going to have problems in 10 years if you don't do this. He didn't say 2 years or 3 years. And that was much more credible to me because it was a 10-year to this is when things will be an issue. And so I think there's a measured approach of what is real. If you try to get some people to do action and you say the world's going to end in 2 days if we don't stop using water or whatever the particular issue is, it can be taken less seriously. And so I think from a Treasury perspective is there's what makes sense economically from sustainable, renewable activity, what makes sense from a borrowing, and there's certainly some incentives, and don't be caught with falling prey to some of the greenwashing. So it looks like you're doing something, but it's not effective. So I think it's measuring where you are, what you want to accomplish. I think that's probably the harder road to fall because there's certainly some people who are like, we have to do everything possible immediately or nothing's going to work. And that can create very, very challenging situations for your company or for your employees and for your trading partners. And there can be, we're not going to do anything, which can leave you behind. Monitoring those risks, the direct and indirect impacts make sense. And so there's certainly more attention to this in the last 5 years than there was 20 years ago. Is it top 10? Oh, absolutely. It's top 10, pretty much in every area. And it's usually top 5. So if all your peers are saying this is something substantive, we need to pay attention to it. So if you're, we like to have pejorative terms, you're a denier or you're an alarmist, right? That always has to be the case. You got to be in the 5% on either end. And I don't know that either of those are helpful positions, like the world's going to end or nothing we do can have an impact on anything. And so I think the fact that a lot of the peers are somewhere in the middle of there's something that needs to be done or accomplished, whether it's having a more sustainable footprint, and I'll leave it up to the listener to define what some of that means, but finding ways to be more efficient. I mean, being more efficient should be more green, if I can use those terms. And so efficiency is always in vogue, and how quickly you put that in place, there can be a financial feedback, because both of those have to have a feedback. Feedback from what's going on legislatively and regulation, which can impact what you do. It can also be done through BlackRock or other people requiring certain things to be put forth and said. And so there's always going to be multiple factors that are influencing and feeding back. So it makes sense from a risk standpoint not to isolate and only focus on one, but to look at multiple. I know you talked around for a while and you said to disagree or whatever or not. I don't know if I disagreed, but I think avoiding the extremes is helpful and the role of a steward of the finances of an organization.
You make a great point, Craig. Moving forward to the second focus area, which is rise in regulatory scrutiny, particularly in response to advancements in artificial intelligence or AI, data access, privacy, and competition. The European Union countries have agreed on a landmark regulation deal, which is the world's first comprehensive AI legislation to regulate the development and use of AI. Last year, the US President signed an executive order focusing on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. Furthermore, over the past few years, the US government has significantly heightened its enforcement initiatives regarding the reporting of foreign bank and financial accounts, or FBAR, with the primary responsibility for such filing lying with corporate treasury and tax departments. Craig, do you think elevated regulatory scrutiny surrounding emerging technologies, privacy, data protection, and FBAR will require corporate treasury teams to allocate resources and time this year, additional time and resources this year, towards mitigating potential compliance risks that can adversely impact a corporation's earnings, trust, and reputation?
No, I don't think it'll require more attention. I think we're, in terms of regulations, there's periods of extreme addition of regulation and times of sometimes extremely quiet. I think it's more of we're at the normal level of regulation right now. So I think there's going to be new tasks. There's going to be things that Treasury needs to pay attention to, KYC, FBAR, GDPR regulations related to privacy. It seems like it's in the normal range the last year or so. We've seen periods, if I go back 15 or 20 years, where there was a financial crisis, and then a year and a half later, and over several years, there's a huge increase in regulations that come out. And there's certainly a number of regulations that are coming out, but I think it's in that normal one standard deviation band of new regulations. Now, when I say that, I don't want it to sound like, oh, there's nothing to do. There is action to do. We don't have periods of time where on a net, we lost 40 regulations that we need to care about and things got easier. It's how much has been added is really what we're looking at. And so to me, it's coming into the normal range. So KYC activities, FBAR in the U.S., beneficial ownership information. Those are a number of the standards that exist. And you bring up a good point on the artificial intelligence regulations on that. These models are trained on data, and especially some of the language models they create information, which is interesting. And like humans, they make stuff up. You can see that from Bard, from ChatGPT. President Trump's former lawyer ran some programs, thought he was using a smart search engine, which was Bard, to reference cases, which would help him get out of his troubles. And it made up cases, made referenceable cases, and the court was like, we can't locate any of these because it made it up based upon, you asked a question, it created things. So this idea of phantom or shadow created information, there's problems there. You don't want to rely on what it just says. You have to still validate information. You can put stuff together very quickly, and that seems to be very compelling. It's like talking to I don't want to say a really good liar, but they create stuff and it's mostly believable and it's hard to tell. And so the training of these systems, there has to be a way of validating and testing. And I could certainly go through examples of where there can be problems, but in different areas of relying on it fully without guidance. So it's a powerful tool, but it can run amok pretty easily. And so we're using it. We're experimenting with it. We're using it. We're being very careful with it to make sure it's taught right, trained right, and checked. Just like you wouldn't take an intern, hey, write this stuff up, and then take what the intern wrote without reviewing it and checking it out. You would do it. You would check it. And we need to do that because it's a very fast intern and probably gives better information more quickly than an intern, but also makes up more stuff than an intern because of its speed.
Dot, train, and check. Those are the key things to remember. The next focal area, which is the third focal point that is expected to be top of mind for corporate treasury in 2024, is the rapidly growing payments ecosystem, given that payments are becoming the centerpiece of corporate treasury. According to payments giant Visa, digital payments have transformed the way we move money. But the explosion of networks and payment methods, from apps and wallets to blockchains, together with legacy infrastructure, has made for a splintered experience. But that is changing. With interoperability taking priority, we expect a more seamless future of global payments, one where moving money across services is as seamless as using one. Visa adds that in 2024, we will continue to see collaboration across the payments ecosystem among banks, financial institutions, merchants, technology providers, and enablers and issuers, bringing us greater global financial inclusion, accessibility, cross-system compatibility, and interoperability. Craig, Do you think that the payments landscape in 2024 will be spurred by the growth in digital payments, greater interoperability in payments, and accelerated adoption of real-time payments?
Yes, yes. And the last one, I would refer to that as more of instant payments as opposed to real time payments due to the official capitalized letter real time payments setup or scheme in the US. And so when we say real time payments, it's always going to create some consternation in the US for that. But the idea of instant payments are payments that settle within about 8 seconds. I mean, all of these are going to have the type of impacts that you're talking about, some of the quotes you referenced. So there's a significant number of use cases for faster. There's a massive number of use cases for better, more information, more seamless, and across the board. And so if we talk about instant payments, they're not just faster. There's usually enriched information that travels, better visibility, better clarity as to when things are going to settle. Those are all positive, and there's broader use cases for this broader set of features and benefits of those. So I think this is significant. And you talked about seamless, and you quoted Visa as interoperability takes priority. We expect a more seamless future for global payments. It goes on to say, one, where moving money across services as seamless as using one. Certainly becoming less friction, moving towards seamless. I think it'll be a long time before everything becomes seamless across the board. But it's gotten significantly better, more global. There's more partnerships where traditional payment rails are partnering with some of the newer fintechs, banks included, to make sure that these methods of payments can move quickly, information occurs, and it works and runs on some of the newer rails. I think that is a major item. I think you've nailed it on that topic. So faster isn't everything, but nothing's getting slower. And there's certainly more use cases for better than just for faster. But where are we seeing things go slower? Nowhere. Where do we see things where people want better? And if you can get better, less friction, better visibility, more streamlined process, that leads to more payments, faster and easier commerce. So there's 2024 and beyond should continue to be good years in the payments landscape and for everybody involved in payments.
Those are wise words, and please be on the lookout for more on this on ctmfile.com and on the Open Treasury podcast. The fourth focal area for corporate treasury teams is a likely spike in payments fraud in 2024. The rapid growth in payments and payments innovation has also led to new opportunities to commit payment fraud. The advent and increased adoption of instant payments may make domestic transactions and cross-border payments faster and more cost-effective than ever before. However, given that instant payments are immediate and irreversible, there will be less time to detect criminal activity or spot fraud. This makes real-time payments more attractive to criminals and will likely result in a surge in payment fraud in 2024. Furthermore, amid the escalating conflict in the Middle East, tense US-China trade relations, and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, there is likelihood of a spike in cyber attacks this year, particularly artificial intelligence or AI-powered cyber attacks. Craig, in the light of a distinct possibility of a surge in payment fraud, do you think it is time more corporations pay attention to ongoing and specific payment fraud training, as say securetreasury.com, for the employees, which is distinct from general cybersecurity training, to minimize the impact of payment fraud and losses in a world of instant payments and geopolitical instability?
Yes, I mean, specialization matters in every discipline, and the distinction between cybersecurity and payment security, there's certainly overlap, but the distinction there matters. And to your point, does it seem like there's going to be more payment fraud? Well, we've been surveying payment fraud year over year, and every single year, those that think that payment fraud and sophistication, the number and types of attacks have gotten more serious, it's either significantly increased or increased. That's always a majority. And there's usually 0 to just a few percent that think it has declined in any year. Now, there's certainly a significant minority or percentage that think it's been, relatively stable to the prior year. But on a net basis, it's all of our peers, all of our payment professionals, treasury professionals say it's getting worse. And this makes sense. We see it. We see that defenses have risen on the cybersecurity front to try to block people from getting into the organizations. And yet the criminals are reaping far larger financial rewards from their financial crimes, from stealing money, from faking people out or spoofing them, or whether it's business email compromise or the use of a deep fake. More money is being exfiltrated out of organizations. Why is that happening? They're getting larger payouts. They're leveraging technology. They're leveraging advanced technology, the tech that enables them to mimic language of what's being used, or even mimic the voice and or a video, if you will, of executives of a company is now available to almost everybody. I mean, the democratization of some of these AI technologies and tools, and the democratization of some of the criminal tools that are used, has made it so everyone can be a criminal. It used to be when you stole stuff, you had to be geographically located where the financial instruments were, or the store of value was. Well, now you can do it from anywhere, and you can do it very cheaply. So everything in that environment means more fraud done more quickly, more cheaply, leveraging technology. So there's more adversaries, and it can be done far less expensively. Across that backdrop, over a long period of time, companies have been strengthening their defenses on cyber. Many have been, adding banking services. Banks now all train their employees every year. The majority of companies now train their employees on different types of cybersecurity, and some on payment security. This has moved in one direction: more training, to banks, essentially 100%. And what's happening there is they're training them more regularly, not just, get a spoof email, see if you report it as a problem, but across the board on topics. And corporations are behind banks, but they're seeking greater levels of training as well. This is a move to protect organizations. And even given that increased level of care, there is certainly the level of fraud, the crime, the losses and loss rates, for the most part, across every payment channel, every type, have increased. So despite significant defenses, the explosion on the criminal side and capacity has favored the criminals in this regard. So this certainly means that having a control framework in place matters. Having people trained, you had mentioned getting trained specifically on payment security. What are the criminals doing? What's their playbook? What are the approaches that they've used? What are cases of how people have exfiltrated money, convinced people, or stole money directly? These are all good learning experiences for those that are involved anywhere in the process, because it makes you more jaded, more suspect of what's going on. And that is essential, because it is dangerous. It's not dangerous out in the world. It's dangerous where you sit, because the world comes to you. The world of criminals comes to you. And, when we think about this idea of how do we protect our assets, our network, our payments, our most liquid assets, who's the superintendent of the overall company security? Well, IT and the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, are responsible for making sure that the environment's protected externally, there's a good wall, and then internally that there's isolations and containers that can prevent a more heinous or grave loss of information, or the technical jewels of the company, by limiting, restricting. The same thing is true on the payment security side, with the treasurer being the superintendent of payments. Now, you and I have talked about what a superintendent means. Is you don't teach everything, you don't mop the floors, you don't drive the school buses, but you're responsible for all of that. Just like IT is the superintendent of overall cybersecurity, but they don't open every email. They put tools in place, and they have to make sure everyone in their domain is paying attention. Same too with the treasurer, to protect payments. And this means you need to have a full inventory of all of your payment flows, types. Should be assessed at least every couple of years. Where are the vulnerabilities from start to finish? Not just technical vulnerabilities, but operational vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that may impact any of the 12 security principles that may or may not be in place. So I think this is a huge point on your list of 8. It's really, really important.
May I ask you a follow-up question? You mentioned the 12 principles, and you also mentioned specialized payment security training. You run securetreasury.com, Strategic Treasurer does. How do you think corporate treasury, in the light of what you just discussed, particularly given the fact that there can be a further spike in payment fraud, how can corporate treasurers and their teams benefit from securetreasury.com using the 12 principles you mentioned?
Well, whether you use training that we have or other training that's focused on payments, it needs to be focused on payments. It can't just be general cyber security, cyber hygiene. That's essential. Those are, table stakes. That's like, do you know how to use Excel or use a key or a scan? Like you have to be able to manage that. But the level of sophistication is greater, and the training has to be specific. So that's the case. But when we have conversations as a consulting firm, we have conversations with lots of clients. There's three areas we tend to help them with. I'm not saying this is a commercial. I know it's a podcast, but it's, in terms of what we focus on, there's three things that we work with companies most regularly on: payment security, payment security assessment, looking at all of the payment flows, understanding the controls, identifying any weaknesses, making sure that there's compensating controls, and then also identifying what needs to be done so that it becomes a leading practice or a very strong and robust practice. It doesn't have to be world class, but people should know where their exposures are, how they're mitigating those, and what the next step is. So that's a really common feature. And then, of course, as we already talked about, having your team trained and tested on a regular basis about the specifics. And then one of the other things which has gained quite a bit of attraction lately is payment pen test, a penetration test. And this is something that I want to say replicated, not copied, but replicated from the cybersecurity front. Is you have an external, white hat participant check to find weaknesses in your digital defenses. Do you block access? Do you mask information so they can't see what the information is? Not just you have a strong password and you lock them out, but you make it so they can't even get to it. Pen tests also make the assumption, for example, that you've been breached, because every company will be breached. And so you grant rights to the tester. And from that testing, they can go and follow through the process of, can they move laterally within the organization and make a difference and find other assets, making the assumption they got in through the walls of the fort and they're inside. How are they contained? How will they be discovered? And so a payment pen test is also looking to say, where can the systems and the people and the processes and the controls be compromised? Where can the information be gathered that allows someone to start taking the long game of understanding who makes approvals? How are these done? What security features are put in place internally? What security controls and services do they have or not have from the different banks that they work with? Once someone has an assessment, they've got the inventory, and they're working to tighten things up, and they have their people trained, a pen test helps identify some additional areas that may need to be buttoned up. But we always like the assessment and training and then the pen test approach.
Terrific insights, Craig. Thank you so much for that. From the 4-part article series titled Top 8 Areas of Priority for Corporate Treasury in 2024, published on ctmfile.com, let's now shift the conversation to the 5th topic, which is a likely increase in corporate defaults in 2024, according to Fitch Ratings. Fitch Ratings has cautioned that there will be an increase in corporate defaults on both sides of the Atlantic in 2024, as the impact of tighter central bank policy will continue to work its way through the US and European economies. However, the ratings agency expects a much shallower Federal Reserve pivot than that anticipated by US markets. It forecasts that US interest rates will fall by 75 basis points through next year, taking the Fed funds rate to 4.75%. Craig, do you think that despite hopes for a pivot from central banks around the world, high borrowing costs will continue to be a burden on corporations this year, resulting in an increase in corporate defaults?
Yes, I think there's lots of indicators to that. We had cheap and essentially unlimited funds for a long time. It was unnaturally reduced for many, many years. And then when inflation started rearing its ugly head, the Fed and other central banks, changed their policy, started increasing the rates that they were charging. And these are some of those rapid rate increases that we've seen in history, very, very quickly moving from essentially 0 or 25 basis points to, 5.5%, or, in that range, the 25 basis point band that they have. And so that moved us to, instead of extremely cheap, it became quite a bit more expensive. That shift was very, very abrupt and rapid. And there's also, it seems in many regards that there's a tightening for a large portion of the economy where there's not access to capital as much. So that's been restrained further, right? Larger companies, really high grade debt companies have always had access to capital, but it's pinched further down the supply chain quite a bit. That's also exacerbated the situation. That's why we see some of these default rates, bumping up around twofold in a fairly short period of time. And the correction, you mentioned some of the rating agencies expect a 75 basis point fall. That mirrors what the Fed has said, and the guidance of, we'll end the year this year in 4.4 to 4.9%, 4.75 falling a little bit towards the 2/3 up in that range. That may provide a little bit of relief, but that's, after free and abundant to something quite different, that's creating challenge. That's a key reason why you have more failures happening.
Finally, Craig, are there any other insights, thoughts, perspectives, or concerns that you would like to air or share with our audience for their benefit?
Yeah, Push, that's a good question. I think the other concern that comes up quite a bit has to do with how companies are adapting to new staff and new technology. We already talked about AI a bit, and how are Treasury groups learning on that? Is this just something that you play with personally? You have it write some poem for you? Does this help with our internal communication, or does it do something more broadly? Are we just experimenting with it, or are we looking at ways we can incorporate some of these powerful tools with care into our models without losing information? So there's quite a bit of concern about that, not just from the regulation side or from an executive order that maybe the U.S. president puts in place, but how do we handle some of these new tools? Because they've come on the scene very quickly from a historical perspective, very quickly, and they're developing and learning very rapidly. There's a concern and a set of concerns there. That's one of the top areas. The other is how companies are hiring, recruiting, hiring, and retaining the new Zoomers, right? They're coming to the workforce. They've been in the workforce 5, 6, 7 years. They're supervisors. Some of them are managers. And each age cohort has some general trends, right? There's differences. How do you take advantage of some of the skill sets, some of the mindsets that are different? How do they get incorporated and folded into an organization effectively? And how do you manage people that are different from your age cohort? Everyone has to deal with that, but there's been quite a few changes there. And that's certainly occupying the mind of a lot of treasurers. We've had a number of sessions where we're talking through things. That's a fairly hot topic as well, because those are our resources on how we do our business. It's not just the tech we have, but it's the people who relate to other people, who have conversations, who run the tech, and look forward. And so finding the right, I don't want to call it balance, but the right way to interoperate with people is another key area, and that'll distinguish those that are really successful from those that are always in a hiring in a challenging mode.
And we look forward to the 2024 Generative AI in Treasury and Finance Survey from Strategic Treasurer. The findings of that would be particularly noteworthy and interesting. Well, we've come to the end of this podcast episode, Craig. Your insights have added a valuable layer to today's podcast discussion. Thank you so much for your time and participation. We would also like to express our deep gratitude to our CTM File audience for joining us on this edition of the Open Treasury podcast. Please subscribe and look in the show notes for the article links. Thank you and have a great week. This podcast is provided for information purposes only, and statements made by CTM File or guests on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, or consulting advice. For more information, visit ctmfile.com.